If there's one thing that I'm susceptible to, it's being personally understood and having people customize what they're doing for my way of living and doing things. Hi, I'm Michael from Michael the Gathering. Welcome to a very special episode of Card of the Day. This is a very rare bonus 6th episode for the week, brought to you by several insistent comments from Andrew Lick, who, a couple of weeks ago, commented a request for Old Thrush, a 2-mana flying 1/2 that gains some life and mana fixes you. It's basically just a draft common. But of course, Andrew proposed it specifically knowing that around the release of The Hobbit, I would do a Hobbit week where I would discuss cards from the set. And at the time, I sort of brushed Andrew off and I sadly went, I do try to do cards that are in all of the colors and you've kind of picked a colorless card. It's not a bad request as cards go, but... And then, of course, as Hobbit Week started, Andrew commented again, very politely, 6th episode. And then he commented again, Old Thrush for Hobbit Week. And I don't know, I'm recording this Tuesday night. He might comment again Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Thank you, Andrew, for requesting what is technically my second most requested card ever after Kiln Fiend. If you feel the desire to move my heart the way Andrew has, please leave a common or uncommon comment down below. And if you want to skip to the front of the line or request something above uncommon, leave a little financial incentive. Now, as I said initially, Old Thrush is actually a pretty interesting card to get into because it's a relatively new kind of draft staple. If you're not especially familiar with what I'm talking about, by sort of bringing up a weird design abstraction here, what we're talking about is whenever you have a new set, generally one of the things that you do to make the sets recognizable as players move from set to set while still playing Magic as a whole is you have not only recurring visual images and archetypes and whatnot, you have mechanical things that also recur. So you have the cancel with set mechanic, for instance. And the more that you look at sets as they're developed, especially below rare, which is why this channel is the way that it is, the more that you see cards that are like this. It's also why I have so many examples to bring up about everything. Old Thrush is a campus guide, which is to say it is a 2-mana creature that is colorless, and it allows you to tutor a basic land and put it on top of your deck. This is important because it means that while a colorless card is providing mana fixing, it's not providing card advantage, or at least cantripping to replace for itself. That is still firmly within the realm of green cards. Which is also deeply ironic because this entire effect used to be well within the realm of green cards. Einok Guide is almost exactly this from way back in Fate Reforged, a 2-mana 1/1 that can either put a +1/+1 counter on itself or tutor a basic to the top of your library when it enters, which since then has morphed into an entirely separate kind of draft archetypical card, the Blanchwood Prowler. But either way, I feel pretty justified in actually stating Campus Guide as the starting point for this effect, which is so satisfying to be able to do. You have no idea how often you want to talk about an effect or some sort of card draft archetype that technically goes all the way back to either a card that uses the name that everybody uses, but it does things a little bit differently. Cough, Oblivion Ring, cough. Or the effect appears in a bunch of sets really consistently and then stops because WotC weren't doing it back then, but actually technically first appeared all the way back here. So this is the card that first invented it, but this is the card that popularized it. And I like to talk about the cards that popularized a thing because usually when it's gotten popularized, it's not just innovating the text on the card, it tends to also be innovating the card being used in its context in the set. You see this a lot with effects that start at rare and then get downshifted to uncommon or common because WotC have realized they are actually useful things that we should do all of the time. In addition to just coming from a relatively interesting and undiscussed lineage of cards, Old Thrush has the benefit of being a somewhat interesting, more defensive version of the campus guide that actually gives us something new to talk about, even if we had already touched on campus guides in general. But what I'll start off with is the simple assertion that you never want to need to be playing a campus guide. There are, of course, many draft sets where you're going to be perfectly happy to be playing a colorless creature that fixes you for a color of mana, even if it doesn't put the card directly into your hand, because maybe it's a 3-color set, or the set's very slow and it's okay that you're not drawing the card immediately. But additionally, in those slow sets, it tends to also be the case that if you're playing a card that's meant for the early game that doesn't then replace itself in the late game, that's going to be a problem. But as a designer myself, it's impossible for me to call these cards bad, because a campus guide is the equivalent of a draft safety net. If you've absolutely bombed out of a draft and you've ended up in 3 colors with just an absolute mess of playables, at the very least, you can probably pick up a colorless mana fixer late to make digging through your deck for your 3rd color that you absolutely should not be playing palatable. And for the WotC designers, there's actually a little bit of tension there in that you want to make these cards good enough that they do the job that they're supposed to do, but you don't want to make them so good that people are actively taking them. Everyone who's drafted has experienced that moment where there's a Terramorphic Expanse or an Evolving Wilds or whatever we're calling it now in the pack, and like 8 other cards, and you just sort of look at that little colorless land and think to yourself, you know, I don't need this, but it's strictly speaking better than half of the chaff commons that are in my colors that I could be taking. If we're talking design goals, you want campus guides to hit right below a Terramorphic Expanse. But of course, this is by default. An important part of any archetypical card is that in the set, you customize it to make it uniquely tailored for what that set needs. This is also just a part of one of my favorite Mark Rosewater philosophies, which is that if you're going to make a Magic card, you need to make the Magic card that could only be made in this context. It's 2027, and we're doing Ikoria versus Kamigawa, the Godzilla plane invading one of the few high-tech planes where they actually have live streaming, and so people are going to be making videos about the horrible things that are happening going on. Let's make a card called Like and Subscribe! But customizing a campus guide is relatively straightforward, because one of the things that Magic loves to mess with is the land system, or the mana system, however you want to call it. The point is that in this case, we're messing with land types. If you look at a set like Lost Caverns of Ixalan, we introduce caves. We're going to have a bunch of different cave decks. We print a card like Compass Gnome, which lets you tutor for basic lands or non-basic caves. Which is, first of all, great just because it allows you to do the stuff that the set wants to do, and also it makes this card more useful specifically to the people who are in a lane that is only going to happen in this set. Shout out to Sam from the Draft Punks for his excellent breakdown of sinuous Benthesaur decks in Lost Caverns of Ixalan. They are a ton of fun if you can play caves in Lost Caverns of Ixalan draft. We saw almost the exact same thing in Outlaws at Thunder Junction, where Desert was a land subtype that was relevant, and we got Silver Deputy, which lets you search for a basic or a desert and put it on top. And then you had a bunch of cards that cared about deserts. Although ironically, most of the cards that cared about deserts were things that specifically searched a land or a desert. And then WotC did something they don't usually do, which is they made the non-basic subtype lands the low-rarity 2-color tap lands for the set, and they gave them crime synergies. OTJ is another all-timer limited set. Magic is fun. Even if you don't have a specific new subtype of land, you can still mess with your campus guide in a relatively simple way in order to fit the needs of the set, like WotC did in Tarkia Dragonstorm with Embermouth Sentinel, a 2-mana 2-1 that searches a basic and puts it on top. unless you have a dragon, in which case it puts it onto the battlefield. And this is a case where this is a colorless creature that's rampant growthing you if you have a dragon, and dragons are in any color, which means this is a rampant growth in any color. But it's also important to note that Tarkia Dragonstorm really needed you to ramp quickly, or else you would get run over by the Mardu deck immediately. When we take all of these and put them into context, Old Thrush is not really doing much in the way of supporting a land type or supporting any particular mechanics of the set. Instead, Old Thrush is kind of a new baseline that we might see going forward, in that it's got a big butt instead of a big tit. I'm talking about the bird, and it has flying and it gains life. Old Thrush is a defensive campus guide. This is a case where the flying can, technically speaking, be used offensively, and I'm sure there are many people who are going to be strapping goblin and dwarf-based war gear to their Old Thrushes. I know that it's anachronistic or whatever, but I've always thought that's one of the funniest things you can do in Magic. I equip the Lightning Greaves to my Old Thrush. How? With this staple gun! But the other thing that I should shout out that's kind of adjacent to Old Thrush is that Hobbit actually has a couple of these cards, these colorless creatures that are messing with the way that draft mana works in an interesting way that we haven't generally seen outside of green. In the same way that Old Thrush continued the Campus Guide tradition of taking Einok Guide's effect out of green, we have Long-Bodied Grey Dog, which should have been the first card previewed, let's be real here, being a kind of colorless jewel thief, which I am all for. I went into it earlier in Hobbit Week with Dory, Bearer of Friends, that 3-mana creatures that generate a treasure on ETB are just really good. They're actually like really fun to play with, and Long-Bodied Grey Dog being a 2/2 flash for 3 mana is really fun, and then it makes up for the being colorless by creating a tapped treasure token, meaning that you actually just cannot use the treasure token the turn that you play it. And while everybody's drawing comparisons between Troop of Ponies and Burnished Heart puts the lands onto the battlefield. Troop of Ponies is a creature cultivate, which means that I expect it to be one of the most played cards in Commander ever, assuming it ever gets reprinted again. I mentioned it's Tuesday, which means it's Dandadan Day. Well, new chapter of Dandadan. I want Season 3 so badly. I love this show so much. Characters are so dorky. The fights are so cool. And also, all the spirituality is really interesting to learn about. Dan-da-dan, dan-da-dan, dan-da-dan.